Tonight on Insights on PBS Hawaii. State lawmakers have wrapped up their official work for 2013, and tonight some of the key players will help us sort through the winners and losers from the legislative session. What new laws will we be living with, and what will they cost? Which state problems have we made progress on, and which will be put off for another year? Now, live in our studio, our host, Dan Boylan.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Dan Boylan. Our state lawmakers this year introduced almost 3,000 bills and passed almost 300. They dealt with the state budget, hurricane relief, early childhood education, campaign finance reform. The list goes on and on and on. The governor now decides what to sign, what to veto, or what to allow to become law without his signature. What passed and failed, and why, and most importantly, what will it mean to you? We elected our legislators, and what they've done during this session affects every one of us. So we hope you'll weigh in with your critique and concerns. What were your top priorities this year? Do you think we're making progress on the issues facing our state? And do you believe lawmakers are putting your tax dollars to good use? You can join our conversation by calling, emailing, or tweeting your questions and comments. The contact information you now see on your screen will be repeated throughout the program. Insights is also streaming live on your computer and will be posted on our website after the broadcast. The live stream is closed caption, just like our broadcast. Now to our guests. Joe Souki is Speaker of the State House of Representatives. He served in the House since 1982 and had a previous life as Speaker from 1993 to 1999. Joe was part of the dissident faction of Democrats during Calvin Say's leadership. This year, those Democrats joined forces with House Republicans to take over House leadership. Joe represents the Maui district that includes Wailuku and Kahului. Donna Mercado Kim is president of the state Senate. She was also new in her post this session, moving up from vice president when Shan Tsutsui became lieutenant governor. Donna has been a lawmaker for more than 30 years, representing Kalihi, Moanalua, and Aiea in the State House and Senate and on the Honolulu City Council. She previously chaired the Senate Ways and Means Committee, and last year she led the committee investigating the University of Hawaii's, I hate this phrase, wonder blunder. Beth Fukumoto is House Minority Floor Leader, one of the young leaders of the Republican caucus in the State House. Beth beat the longtime incumbent in the last election to represent her Mililani district. She was previously Chief of Staff to former House GOP leader Gene Ward and worked as Director of Minority Research. And Blake Oshiro is Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Neil Abercrombie. He spent most of the session working to advance the governor's legislative agenda. This was Blake's second session on the governor's team, but he's a veteran of the legislative process, having represented an Aiea Halawa district in the State House for 11 years, part of that time as majority leader. Blake, I'm sad to say, is an attorney by profession. Most of the time, the last few sessions, when we've met at this table at the end of the session, it was always a story of, golly, we didn't have any money. This year, there was some money, and doesn't money make all the difference, former Chair of Ways and Means?
Absolutely. It makes all the difference. Having more funds so that we can fund our programs and make sure that we take care of our safety net and to be able to make sure that the government functions are being run appropriately really makes a difference.
And Joe, you were of course were House Finance Chair for many years. Yes. This year there was money there.
Yes, and this is the second time where I found myself in a situation where there is money. If you remember, they had the bubble in the 80s, right, and I was the finance chairman then. And now again, luckily, during my recycled term as Speaker, we have a bubble again. And I believe that the House and the Senate use it very wisely and prudently. We use the money so that we'll take care of the unfunded liability, would take care of and replace the funds from the rainy day fund and the hurricane fund, and after doing all of that, take care of all of the labor needs, and still end up with a surplus. Yes, it was real nice to have the extra dollars to work with.
But all of this is dependent upon, of course, the Council of Revenue's projections being correct, right?
Absolutely.
And if they don't, then we may not be in such great shape.
Well, and we're only in great shape for this coming year and next year because of all of the collective bargaining contracts. The out years does not look as good. And as I said in my opening day speech, we have to take care of our foundation because our foundation certainly has been whittled down. And as the speaker said, you know, we did fund some of the things that we had to use in those hard times, but we've learned that, you know, every time you put a new program, there's going to be future costs. So we have to be mindful of that.
Your boss asked, I believe, for about $250 million more dollars than the legislature gave him. How's he respond to that? I mean, are you guys discouraged? Bad session from your point of view?
I think he's very pleased actually, because what we look at it as is we were able to achieve a lot of our priorities, whether it was on early education, whether it was on our high growth initiative, whether it was on 21st century schools. And what the legislature did was they gave us some of the funding that we requested so that we can prove that we can actually do this. So while we may have requested for both years, instead the legislature said, we'll give you the first year, come back, prove that we can do it, and then maybe we'll look at it for the second year. So that's how we're going to take it, is they've given us sort of this chance, and we're going to run with it.
Beth Fukumoto, you'll excuse my metaphor, but you 7 Republicans got in bed with the Democrats to form the House majority this year.
Correct.
And how are you able to find yourself if you're holding hands with the likes of Souki and the other Democrat, the other Democrats who made up the majority?
Well, that's an argument or a question a lot of Republicans are asking us these days. But I think we actually came out with a relatively conservative session, and I think that we were able to make a positive impact on the way the budget was run and everything else. And I think that we actually did a good job of being able to get fiscally conservative measures out there, like funding things we've been asking to fund for a while, like refilling the Hurricane Relief Fund and that sort of thing. So I actually think we made meaningful progress, and we're actually able to impact policy in a way that we haven't been able to do before.
I've never seen a Republican sit at this table and say that they were for gambling, however. Not a one. And yet, that you have always been pro-gambling. You sold out, didn't you, to get this Republican support? You let gambling go.
Well, I didn't let gambling go. I believe that the members wasn't ready for gaming, and being a change speaker, I looked at the needs of the House and of the Senate as where they're going, and gambling was not in the writing on the wall at this point in time. But it doesn't mean that it's not in the future. And hopefully we'll be back with that item again. As the President stated, for the long term, for the out years, it doesn't look that good because of the relatively generous allotments to labor and the negotiations. Looking at year 2019 or so, you're looking at $1.9 billion that we're going to have put aside for all this labor cost. So the question is, how are you going to arrive at that dollars? And so we may have to seriously look at enhancement of some kind as we go along. You've served in the House for 11 years, right? 11 years.
Yes.
So you saw the Say leadership. You've seen this guy's leadership. What's the difference between them?
I would say that there is a real different tact when it comes to how to deal with the budget. You know, under Speaker Say, that was when we were going through the recession. And so there really was an openness towards looking at small fee increases as ways to kind of achieve whether it could be self-sustaining programs. This year, under the new leadership, we saw that that was not an approach that was viable. What they felt was the programs needed to be generally funded more oftentimes than not, because ultimately that's how you have accountability to the legislature, is if they control it. Whereas if the money's going through a special fund, then oftentimes it's the departments that control it. And so that was a very, very different approach that we saw this session. And so, to be honest, it's something that we'll have to adjust for next session, because we prepare our agenda in November and December. We make certain assumptions on who's going to be there. Then we come in January and everybody changes, and we're like, well, our bills are done already. So we're just going to have to adjust next time around.
But what do you say to legislators who now have to pay for the union things that you guys negotiated. Have to figure out a way to do it.
Well, I would say that we're very, very pleased that the legislature passed the permanency of the tourism accommodation tax, the hotel room tax, and kept it at the 9.25% level. That in the out years really will help us sustain our financial plan, because it's about almost about $200 million every single year that we will continue to realize. Although the one good thing that did happen was we increased the money that goes to the Hawaii Tourism Authority for some additional marketing.
But even with that, the out years does not look good.
By the out years, you mean 5 years down the road?
Exactly.
Unless revenue doesn't increase somehow or another.
Or we continue to cut programs, or we look at how to become more efficient, and that's a key.
Donna, there are cynics out there who think that all we do is pay for state workers and their contracts. I think there are even some Republicans who feel that way, and they're not cynical,
sure
they're just Republicans. Is that a legitimate criticism?
Well, I think we really have to take a really good look at government and define the services of government. You know, what should government be paying for, and what should the citizens be paying for? And, you know, it falls upon businesses at the end of the day to be able to help pay for some of this stuff. And so that's a real key. I really think we have to look at what, in fact, should government be funding. And until we come to that, we're going to be in the same situation we're in now. Funding any program that people feel sounds good, motherhood and apple pie, and government should fund it.
I think somehow we need to get a message to the public that we have the most centralized government in the nation. We run every conceivable program. We run education, we run health systems, we run the social service system, we run agricultural system, we run the courts, the district courts, the circuit courts. A lot of these services in mainland jurisdiction is run by the cities and by the counties. The state never runs everything like we do. Education, higher, lower, we run that. And some years ago, the counties got us to take over the health system, the education system, the court system, and we obliged under Act 97. So this put an additional burden. And may I further state that when the public look at state government, they need to look at the programs they want, but the programs is individual. It's people who run it. And if you want the program, you need to keep the respective staff in that department. A lot of times the public get confused between programs and staff. We are overstaffed, but it's the staff that makes the programs work. And I think this is the message that somehow it's not getting out to the public. One is that we're too centralized. Maybe it's a government that we cannot afford, and we should never have gotten involved. But we have it now, so we're trying to do the best we can under the situation. But we do need revenue enhancements for the future to take care of the out years. The out years are not good.
Beth, do you like holding hands with a man who says we need revenue enhancement in the future as a Republican?
I think we've actually done a really good job of being able to achieve a lot of compromise in the House this year, so that doesn't concern me. I ran for office because I thought we needed more dialogue, and I think this is dialogue, and I think, you know, we're in a position now to have better dialogue about these things, whereas in the past, tax increases just passed and there was no Republican say in it. So.
But you know as well as I do, if that was Gene Ward sitting there right now, when he said that, he'd do backflip, right? But
I'm not Gene Ward.
But you're very bad. You're working for him. I like Gene very much.
I like him too.
You know what I mean. You younger folks are in the Republican legislature, compared to Sam Sloan in the Senate or with Gene. They're pretty conservative guys compared to the four of you, yeah?
Correct. I think we're conservative in our own ways. I wouldn't say that we're not conservative, but I think we understand the reality of politics in Hawaii, which is that we are right now 7 people in the House. So I think we need to do what we can to change the course of the legislature, but we are only 7 people. So part of being able to change that course is linking up with people that can help us and will listen to our ideas. And I think Speaker Souki and our coalition has been willing to do that.
But you got out of this, just 3 vice chairmanships, right? vice chair positions?
And an influence on policy.
And
that
an
I think
influence
we did
on,
have, yes.
on policy. Yeah. He's going to claim all sorts of things.
Yeah, well, I do want to say all sorts of things. But I just want to say this legislature was a very prudent, conservative legislature. They, with these additional dollars they could have been spending a lot more. But in fact, they invested together with the Republicans into the unfunded liability, a very substantial investment of $217 million, of course, with the cooperation of the governor's office.
But we're talking $22 billion of unfunded liabilities. Is that not correct?
That is correct, but this is a good start. We're talking about $217 million that we could have spent elsewhere, but we put it for the unfunded liability. Plus, we spent an additional $160 million to put it to replace the hurricane fund and the rainy day fund for future and put us in a more sound fiscal basis, and with a very nice surplus to carry over into the following year. So we were prudent, we were conservative in working with all parties within our legislature.
Donna, Blake, whichever wants to deal with this one. A year ago, the PLDC was something that a lot of people were opposing. The legislature passed. Now you guys talk about backflips. You guys turn your back on that. And yet, if I'm not mistaken, you also passed bills which are going to allow sort of shortcuts with privatization and using school lands, right, for building to help fund repairs on the schools.
Well, I think the original idea behind PLDC was to look at some of our school lands and to see whether or not we could do some meaningful development to help. What had happened, and it's not so much turning your back, but the fact that when the PLDC law was initially passed a couple of years ago, that there wasn't a whole lot of dialogue. It was something that people didn't really pay attention to. And so when you don't have people participating and in dialogue, the bill comes to pass, and then all of a sudden the community says, whoa, what's happening here? And I think that the legislature really listened to the public, and you're finding that with social media and with the internet and everything, technology, that more and more people are getting involved in their government and people want to have a say. And because of that, we're listening. And I believe we're a lot more transparent than we were in the past. And I think it's really our hats off to the public, to the citizens, to be able to influence what's going on in their government.
Yeah, can I just say, the Public Land Development Corp, I think one of the problems, the biggest problem, was that it provided huge exemptions in the process. It overrode a lot of zoning and county rule, home rule, and that to me is problematic. And that was what we heard, I think, when you went out for public hearing through the administrative rule process. And like the president had said, because the bill had kind of developed at the last minute, there wasn't a lot of discussion. So the discussion arose through the administrative rule process. And that's where our administration really started hearing people. And so what we did was, at that point, I think we realized the legislature was interested in repeal. Governor said he's open to repeal, and then he signed the law that repeals it. But it's very different than the 21st Century Schools bill, because that has no exemptions in it. It has no fast tracking. It has nothing in it except just the opportunity for a public-private partnership. And so that's really what it does, is just set forth the framework without any fast tracking.
I believe one of you, Governor Abercrombie's, at least his State of the State speech, he talked at great length about the need for early childhood education.
Yes.
And yet both House and Senate stepped back on that. He asked for, what, $20 million or something like that, or more?
$22.9 million. What he wanted to do was serve the 3,500 children, 4-year-olds that will not be in that, or will be in that gap group with the change in the mandatory kindergarten age coming on July 1st, 2014. Instead, I think after further negotiations and working with the House and Senate leadership, they agreed to give us a little more than $6 million, so about $7 million, which will allow us to cover the low-income children, which is probably the most needy population. And so we're very pleased with that, because we think that that is, if there is any population that we wanted to address, it is the low-income families.
Now, wait a minute, Blake. Are you trying to tell me there's nothing you're displeased about in this session?
I will say that we are displeased that the minimum wage didn't pass. I think that was something that was a big proposal that we were hoping, especially with the president having said something in his State of the Union, excuse me, that we would have had that opportunity as well, but that didn't pass. So we're hoping maybe next session.
I saw some executive salaries listed in the paper a couple of weeks ago, and I believe I saw some salaries like $3.5 million for, I think there was even one $5 million a year, and you guys couldn't pass the first change in minimum wage in what, 17 years or something like that, 14 years since we last raised the minimum wage? Come on, Beth.
Well, I mean, I think most studies that I've looked at and economists have said that actually will not improve poverty in Hawaii if we pass a minimum wage increase. What would be better is if we did a low-income tax credit or an earned income tax credit or something like that. Minimum wage doesn't necessarily affect the cost of living for people. It might be a slight bump, but not enough to pull people out of poverty.
You Democrats agree with that?
To some degree, yes. And the fact that our minimum wage is right up there, I believe there's only 2 other states with higher minimum wage than we have. I think the biggest concern with the minimum wage increase was to whether or not we could also have a tip credit as part of that minimum wage. So I believe that conversation will continue next year as we continue to look at what is the entry level and where is there room for advancement and for raises and encouragement for these people to enter into this entry level. And you need to have that as well. And there are a lot of businesses out there who have expressed their concern that they may not be able to continue their business and therefore lay off people. So those are all things that you need to balance.
Another question is there was a difference on a tip credit. And I think one was $3, the other one was 35 cents. But
$2.
I think the House felt a little differently and felt that the tip credit might be too difficult and too expensive for the smaller restaurants and the smaller businesses, and especially restaurants. Now, when you take a small mama-san restaurant where the waiters and waitresses don't make too much money, they don't make too much tips, and you have a $3 tip credit there, they will come out losing a lot of money. And so we're not helping at all. But and in fact, we're making the situation worse. That's our particular feeling. And we are certain that in further negotiations with the Senate that we can work and reach a compromise on a tip credit. I think we both believe that there should be an increase in the minimum wage. It's just that there was a crux of that wage. And now we have a nice relationship with the Senate. I'd like to make mention. We meet with Senate leadership about once a week. And I get to see the Senate President once a week, which is always a joy. And we're able to socialize somewhat and begin to collaborate, which is very important. And I think this is how you can look at the legislature. If anything, there's 2 things that stand out with this legislature. One is transparency, 2, collaboration. And I think through those 2 items, we have been able to move forward.
Okay, Dan, even though he said all those nice things about me, I have to correct him on the tip credit.
Yes. Go right ahead.
Well, we have differences, you know.
The Senate proposed anywhere from $1 to $2, not $3 for a tip credit. And the House was 10 cents over the 25 cents. So that was a huge disparity there in the tip credits.
Donna, I can't let this pass. I should let it pass. But he says, getting to see you every week. I can think of one person who would not be happy to see you.
I don't
we will talk about that a little bit later. But anyway, somebody sent it, Jeff from Honolulu. The Stevens-Tyler bill was an incredible waste of resources. Jeff, the Stevens-Tyler bill.
Oh, the privacy.
The privacy bill. Now, I've read other criticisms of that bill. Why did you guys spend so much? Why did you?
House didn't pass it.
You guys passed it.
Yes, it was heard in the Transportation Committee. I don't believe that a whole lot of resources, it just was one more bill that was heard and passed out of the Senate over to the House, and the House didn't pass it any further. So it really didn't take a lot of resources. It's one of the 3,000 bills and did not pass.
Last week we were talking here about same-sex marriage, and I've been told that there are votes in both the House and the Senate next session to pass a bill that would change civil unions to same-sex marriage. Is that true?
Well, if I could count votes ahead of time like this, then I might have my crystal ball out there. But you
wouldn't bet on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't bet on it. And based on what we passed for civil unions, certainly you would think that there'll be the votes there. But there's all sorts of details within the bill itself that may cause people to think otherwise.
What about the House?
The House position is to await the decision of the courts. And before we proceeded, we wanted to see what the courts would come out with.
Which should be sometime this summer.
Yes. Sometime this summer. Based on the decision of the courts, I believe we're willing to move with it. I believe that there is sentiment in the House for the passage of the Marriage Equality Act, but it takes two chambers to act.
Beth, Republicans have been split on this. There are social conservatives within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as well. But, I mean, do you have any sense of where Republicans would be on this, say, in the House?
I think if you just look at the civil unions vote, it was actually split. The Republicans split right down the line, just like the Democrats did. So I think it'll be tense, and it'll be a close vote. I'm not too sure where it'll land.
I'm going to ask a man what he thinks, who was kind of instrumental in getting the civil unions bill passed. What do you think, Glenn?
Well, I think, sort of as Speaker Souki had said, is it really will depend what the United States Supreme Court does on the Defense of Marriage Act. I think if the courts strike that down, there's suddenly 1,100 federal benefits that become available to couples being married. And so that is a very substantial benefit. Right now, I think if you ask for what's the distinction between a civil union and a marriage, without those benefits, it's not substantive, it's really more philosophical. And so I think that court decision will be pivotal in determining whether people's minds will change. Mm-hmm. If that court doesn't strike down the law, then at that point I think it's a philosophical argument and it's a little bit harder to gain that momentum.
As we were sitting here last week, I think, or just before we went on the air, Rhode Island became the 10th state come out, and apparently it's before the Minnesota legislature now. Question, as a voter, Susan from Molokai wants to know, as a voter, I want to know an easy way to find out how my representative voted on issues such as gambling, because I'm opposed to it, she says. But what's the easy way to find out how you guys have voted?
To go online.
Cybernet. Go online. And there you say exactly how everyone voted.
Invest in our kids. Fund early education to keep them out of prison as adults. Now, which is more costly to the taxpayer? 2 years of early ed or a lifetime of prison housing? Stop developments, period, especially over prime ag land. What are we going to do? Eat cement. Somebody did that on Facebook. We got a lot of opinions there, a lot of comments. How do legislators justify their pay increase when they fail to increase the minimum wage? Any thoughts there?
Well, at this point, I don't believe we have much of a choice. There's a law in place, and we'll be getting it. Now, I feel just as badly. I wanted the minimum wage to pass, and the public can be assured that we'll work very hard to get the minimum wage passed. But saying that does not resolve the problem of underemployment that we have in the state. Mm-hmm. The biggest problem we have is underemployment. And until we can resolve that problem, we'll always have a problem of poverty here in Hawaii.
Karen on Cover It Live says, after all the progress that's been made by previous administration, cutting our state budget by reducing unnecessary positions, why are we destroying those gains by restoring so many positions?
I think what you actually saw during the times when we were cutting positions is you saw things like vector control, where we actually lost a lot of positions, and suddenly you have huge amounts of infestations going on, or you have a lack of agriculture inspectors. And so people, like your other guy, wants to know, why aren't we protecting prime ag lands and actually growing our own stuff and exporting stuff? It's because we don't have inspectors. So things come in. You have more invasive species. And so there are definite times when cutting out the positions are necessary, like the House did on somewhat of this budget pass. But there are other times when you need to restore, when it comes to essential governmental services, that if the government doesn't do it, nobody else is going to do it.
I want to ask a question. It's kind of an insider question, but how is, as I understand it, the Senate Ways and Means Committee and the House Finance Committee chairs work together much more so than in the past. Yes. How or why is that allowed? I mean, how did that I mean, they always fought. We expect a fight, on a terrific 3 a.m. argument over the budget, but it didn't happen. Why not?
It's a change in the leadership. It's a change in the individuals. And for years, I don't think we all enjoyed the late night, 11 o'clock, midnight hour chaos that went on at the legislature. And part of it was because we didn't have a discipline, and we said we would have a deadline of 6 p.m. Well, 6 p.m. came and nobody believed it was the deadline, and all these bills were allowed to extend, and they extended into 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and as a result. And it caused a lot of chaos and no transparency on some of these bills and deals that were made at the last hour. So over the last 2 years, last year I think we extended 4 or 5 bills, and this year 0 bills. And when we first did it with the House didn't believe that we were going to hold to that 6 o'clock deadline. And when we did, a lot of crucial bills died. And the administration wasn't happy, the House wasn't happy, and so last year we said we're going to stick by the deadline again and allowed only a few money bills. And this year, no bills. Speaker and I said we are holding to the deadline, and it forced the legislators to come to agreements by 6 o'clock, and if not, it was dead.
Beth, Republicans have long argued that there's not enough transparency down at the legislature. Did you find enough?
Enough, no, but definitely improved. It's having worked there in the past and being there now, there's a big difference. Just finishing finance, I was on finance committee and I expected to be there till 1, 2, 3 in the morning, but we finished by 7 o'clock every day, and I think it was because we were efficient and more transparent.
Beth, I think you're about 19 years old, something like that. And I know you've had some time down at the legislature, but tell me, what's the real, I mean, you were a staffer with Jean, and then you got elected this year, and it's your first session. I know it's, what's the change? What's the difference? What surprised you about it?
Surprised me about this year?
About being a legislator, as opposed to being a party member and a staffer.
Sure. I think the biggest difference for me was being able to be a part of policy discussions. It was something that I wasn't expecting coming in because I've seen the way Republicans were sort of treated in the past. But coming in this year and just being able to, having chairs actually ask me what my opinion was on a bill and how we should tweak a bill, and people actually caring, if you're voting no, why are you voting no? Is there a way we can fix it? And asking that question was huge, and that's not something I've ever been a part of before. So that was nice.
How do you do that now? Do you caucus with the Democrats in the No. Democrats caucus together. Dissidents in.
Ideologically, we're still different.
Right.
On bills that are quote unquote little too liberal, they will vote against it. And they have continually voted against measures that they don't feel confident with. And we don't caucus together. They have their own caucus, and we have our own caucus. Ideologically, we remain different. But there's a lot of areas where we can find commonality. And that's what we did this time. We found commonality with the Republicans, with the Senate, with the governor, and I believe we came up with a fairly good session through a combination of all of these things, whereas in the past you didn't have this.
Beth, it's just you and me talking. Okay. Nobody's paying any attention. How many times in the Republican caucus in the House how many times, can you do it on just 2 hands, did somebody say, Souki, he's not living up to his word. I mean, he's not doing right by us the way he said he would. How many times?
People have been generally happy. I'm sure there's always, and you hear about it whenever it comes up, there are always certain little things here and there. But and there were actually a record number of caucus no's. People make, a mistake of thinking the Republican Party lost its identity in all of this in forming a coalition, but it actually provided us an opportunity. We were able to find common ground in some areas, but to really define what the Republican message is going to be, we've actually done a better job of that than we have in the past. So we definitely still have disagreements, and he hears about them when we have them, but we were able to find common ground, which is what people are actually asking for from their legislature and government officials,
yeah,
really.
They don't care if we're Republicans or
No.
Democrats. They just want us to deal with the issues and solve some of the problems.
Yeah.
You found out how long before this session started that you were going to be Senate President?
Maybe 2.5 weeks.
And then, and how did, I mean, you were the,
He found out later than I did.
that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. But he had some experience in the job. Admittedly, it was. He may have forgotten that experience. It was so long ago. But somebody, I was talking to somebody down the session. Said, "Think about that guy. He waited and he got his revenge. It took him a few
Not
years."
really, it wasn't revenge.
I know, but
it was an opportunity.
But you're, I mean, extraordinary patience. What's the? You've been in the House. You served in the House. You've served in the Senate. Now, as Senate President. What did you do as Senate President that you had been thinking about for a long time?
Oh, one of the things that one of my pet projects is creating the Museum for Hawaiian Music and Dance. It's one of the things that I've long advocated for. I believe that our host culture, I believe that Hawaii is defined by our culture and that the music and dance is the soul of the Hawaiian culture, and that it was a shame that we didn't have something dedicated to preserving and perpetuating the music and dance.
Donna, I thought there are a lot of people that I'd hate to be asked questions by, and one of them would be sitting across from you at trying to give testimony at a committee meeting that you were chairing. We're going to lose in the last 3 presidents of the University of Hawaii. We're averaging 4 years tenure now, and the one that recently resigned, I'm sure it's because of her health, but I think it has something to do with some really rough times with the legislature. What's your beef, and not just your beef, but the university is feeling like we're not loved anymore down at the ledge. Is that a fair thing to say?
No.
No.
No, absolutely not. We love our university. I attended the university for 2 years. We just want the university to be better. It's grown so large, and there's got so much bureaucracy, and there's not enough oversight, enough transparency, and enough accountability. And they have gone too long without being accountable. And what we're seeing now is that the public are demanding that we have accountability.
Blake, you were going to say something.
No, I think that previously, the university has always waved the flag of autonomy all over the place. And unfortunately, what we saw, I think, through the Stevie Wonder thing was just sort of the thing that opened up the can of worms. And once people started really looking at it, there were a lot of questions, I think legitimate questions. And so it became problematic, and it became a credibility issue with the leadership, I think, the university leadership. But I do agree with the president. I mean, all the state legislators, the governor, we deeply care about our university because we do see this as the equalizer of society. But the only way that's going to happen is we have to make sure that they're accountable and that the money that they're spending is being spent wisely and in the best and most efficient manner.
See, Dan, go ahead.
Can I answer something in that? I take a little different tack. I was a member of the ERTF some years ago, and the autonomy came out of that came out of the ERTF to provide more autonomy for the university, and that we would give them the autonomy, and if they would be allowed to keep their tuition. And in some respect, I believe we need to share the problem because somehow the legislature has some responsibility and the governor some responsibility in the appointment of the regions, and the bigger fault lies with the regions who have a responsibility to provide the policy, not us per se, the regions, and we had a hand in the appointment. Even the House had a hand through selecting people who would sit in a committee to select the Board of Regents, the Senate for the confirmation, and the governor in the process for the selection. So we all share in this. So I had to point the finger only to one I think is not necessarily correct. The end result may be good. It may be a wash and you clean it and that's fine. But I myself don't particularly care for the process.
Caller suggests that next election, the candidates more accurately describe the party to which they belong. Example, Republican, Democrat, dissident Democrat, Tea Party Democrat, Independent, etc. Any comment from 3 Democrats and a Republican on this? There's some truth to this. Isn't there?
No, there is.
I look at myself as being a moderate Democrat.
I agree. I tend to be more moderate and sometimes even conservative Democrat.
Moderate Republican to conservative sometimes.
Where are you one or the other?
I think sometimes I'm a little bit more socially conservative, not as much as some other people, but I am more socially conservative.
And where would you consider yourself more leaning a moderate Democrat?
Moderate Democrat with a conservative fiscal policy.
Conservative fiscal.
I'm conservatively fiscal, very liberal as far as laws is concerned, and statutes like criminal deregulation and those kind of things. Yeah, I am.
And you're
I'm a true progressive. So, you know, but what I would say to that person is it's actually up to the voters to really question their legislators on their issues, because that's where you will determine, despite whatever their label is, what you care about is their issues, because that's not how people vote, is by their label. People vote because of the issues. So it's actually incumbent upon the voter, if that's what you care about, question the actual candidate.
And the problem is that not enough people question us. I go door to door, and I'm lucky if I get 3 people that want to ask me a question. They take the brochures, they thank you. In fact, they almost want to get rid of you and not want to stand there and ask you any questions. So they're not holding their elected officials accountable, and they need to do that.
I remember at the end of his first life as a state representative, Bert Kobayashi said to me, you know, the thing that I expected more when I was a member of the legislature, I'd have more discussions with my constituents about issues. And he says, after the campaign, you didn't see them. They didn't come around anywhere near as much as you thought they would. And of course, often it's just handing a pamphlet. They're not even talking to you then. There's a lot of talk about transparency. You guys passed a bill, if I'm not mistaken, a different bill actually in both houses about these PACs and the way they're funded, and saying that the top 3 contributors have to be published. Is that?
That would be a House position. Yeah.
That's the House position. And what's the Senate bill?
The one is the top contributor must be revealed.
And this is largely a reaction to the mayoral election this past year, right? Mm-hmm. Where one local PAC, although by the time it was over, it spent so much money. We all knew who it was, right? You're a lawyer. Doesn't that have something to do with when the feds come up against, or federal law, as long as it's a state campaign? Yeah. That's what this...
Well, actually, Citizens United, what it says was you can't prohibit PACs and the amount of money that they want to spend. That's freedom of speech. But what the states can do is put disclosure requirements, because you're not prohibiting the actual speech. You're just saying that if you can do all the speech you want, but you better be able to say who it's coming from. And so that's sort of a limitation that's allowable. I think for the governor, you know, you had asked earlier about whether he's going to veto something or what's his process. And I think when you have a bill like that with 2 maybe potentially contrasting ideas, at that point he's going to have to make a choice. So obviously with something like that, then there's only one that can prevail at the end of the day.
One of the other issues we've talked about around this table during the session was marijuana and the legalization of marijuana. This happened in Colorado now. I think it's happened in, Washington State, is it? Or does that kind of a bill have any legs in the coming session?
The House position was to wait and see how the reaction in Colorado and in Washington. And because there still is a federal law that opposes the legalization. So we want to see how the federal law will react or interact with the state law that was passed both in Colorado and Washington. So the House position was not to pass anything this time, and to wait a couple of years and to see what will happen in Washington and in Colorado.
Beth, no, you're not Beth. No. You're Donna. Come on, Dan. You can do this, Dan. What's the Senate's position?
Well, the Senate felt that we shouldn't be spending all our resources and time in criminalizing some of these small amounts of marijuana, and so we looked at let's go ahead and possibly decriminalize it or lessen the penalty for the possession of small quantities of marijuana.
Is there a Republican position on this?
Republican position? No, actually, we have a very mixed caucus on this issue. But my personal feeling, I agree. I think some decrim measure might be a good idea. I was more in agreement with it until I actually talked to a bunch of high school kids who said, nope, we're still going to do it anyway, and it's not going to help at all. It's just going to make it worse, which made me sort of rethink the decrim thing. But I think there's some merit that we still need to think about, because we are wasting a lot of resources right now going after people for small quantities.
What's the governor talking about on marijuana?
I think, in looking at his departments, they all oppose the decriminalization, the Attorney General, Public Safety Department, as well as Department of Health. So that would largely inform whatever the governor's decision would be. I think it depends on how much the decriminalization is, if it's just a pure violation, and what the actual amount of the possession is. I think there was something about 1 ounce or 20 grams, and so it really depends on some of those factors that would dictate, I think, what the governor's position is.
Isn't there a problem with it, with something? It's kind of like one of these things where it says don't walk on the grass, but the shortest way to get there is to walk on the grass. And I mean, I don't want to say everybody, but I mean an awful lot of young people, an awful lot of old people of my generation have certainly done their puffing, and see they continue to do so. And so if that's going on, and people are growing it, and how can we put this off much longer?
That's exactly the concern of the House, and that's why we didn't vote on the Senate bill on the decriminalization. We felt that if you're going to have a marijuana law, if you're going to, just as well you legalize it so you can tax it. Right now, we're not getting any revenue from this outlawish type of marijuana that we have it. But if you're going to legalize it, you'll be able to tax it, and it's been done anyway right now. I would say, what they said, 57%, I think, of the community favors the legalization of marijuana. And that was the big difference between, I think, the Senate version and the House version. And I'm not opposed to also decriminalization, but the caucus at that time felt it would be best to wait. I think it has merit. It has merit.
And if we actually could grow it and be one of our crops on our land, that would be a revenue source for the future that I think that Hawaii would be in the forefront.
And you won't need any gaming then.
Yeah, you won't need any gaming.
And that lady from Molokai would be happy with you.
Would be happy. You'll be smiling all the way.
We'd all be smiling.
And we'd all be happier.
We'd all be happier.
Another issue we talk a lot about around this table, and it comes up year after year after year after year, is affordable housing and the homeless. Is there anything that happened in the legislature this session that would in any way, shape, or form alleviate that problem?
We actually passed a really good measure. It was Senate Bill 515, and it included a bunch of different programs, including Housing First, which I'm a big proponent of, that helps get people into housing. And it's part of a larger DHS wraparound program, which would give people sort of, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a wraparound of different services to try to make sure that people are rehabilitated and get housing and everything all at once. So I actually think we did some good things this session.
Yeah, the legislature actually also appropriated $2.8 million for additional housing programs and some rehabilitation programs. So that will really help with the transition, I think, for people that are going through that problem.
Moses in Nanakuli wants to know, how do the panel feel about giving the University of Hawaii total autonomy? Pros or cons?
Well, I favor it.
Your favorite?
Total autonomy does not equate to no accountability, however, and I believe they have pretty much all autonomy except for the fact that they keep coming to the legislature because they need more money.
University's good at that around the country. But legislatures are giving universities less and less money.
I tend to think nobody deserves total autonomy. I think there are things of statewide concern, and it is up to the state government to make sure that certain policies are in place unilaterally across all government systems. And so I do agree with some degree of autonomy, but complete autonomy is problematic.
I agree. I think there needs to be some oversight at this point because the accountability and transparency has just not been there.
May I just add?
You're the speaker, man. You can add anytime you want, Joe.
I think that's one of the basic problems of the state, that we want to absorb and too much for the state to do. And I think the state need to delegate more than what they're doing now. They can't afford all what they're doing. And to properly provide the funding and the oversight is a very difficult role for the state right now. They don't have the capability of doing it at this point. Now, I applaud what is happening right now, especially by the Senate President. We're trying to keep it in check. But I believe it goes one step beyond that. We need to provide them the resources, and then they'll say, okay, this is your show. It's up to you and how you and to the public as to how they react to how the university is existing.
But we've done that. We've done that. We've given them a 2-year exemption to the procurement code, and they messed that up. We've given them tuition. They keep raising it, and it's the public. I have to emphasize that. It is the public and their calls that have asked the legislature and asked me to hold the university accountable. Somebody at the end of the day has to hold somebody accountable. Otherwise, they're going to continue to do what they're doing, and the public has no say, and our tuition cost is going to go sky high, and we're not going to be able to educate our young people from Hawaii. We're not going to even be able to get them jobs at the university as it's going. We tend to spend money. Search firms, and what are the mainland search firms? They give us mainland people to come and run our university.
That's another issue, isn't it?
Sorry, I'm very passionate about this.
No.
I think I touched the wrong button.
Well, I can understand that. I just did a little thing looking back, in the territorial days. They were mainly mainland guys, I think. The average, it was about 12 years for a university president. And actually we had some long, since statehood, Fudge Matsuda was 10 years, Al Simone, Ken Mortimer were 8. And we had a successful 5-year presidency, I think, with David McClain.
And I'm not saying, that race or where you're from has anything to do with it. But I really think that we need to make a better effort at looking at our local people and looking at the students that are being educated at the university and be able to give them opportunities as well, and we don't always have to look outside the state.
Another argument, however, that I've read nationally is that universities don't do a very good job sort of mentoring future presidents,
exactly.
From within their own ranks. And
I think Fudge Matsuda did a good job in mentoring and making sure that we have people from Hawaii that went through the different training positions and so forth, so that we did have a bench that we could go to when we needed people to step in.
I personally like my representatives, but with 90% of the public voting in a newspaper poll, I don't believe that that's a scientific poll, but maybe it is. Giving legislature a grade of D or F for the 2013 legislature, why should we have any faith in a 2014 legislature or even vote for any incumbent? Well, I think you've all argued that you think you did better than a D or F, right?
Well, again, it's the public that goes to vote, and I always tell them, if you're not happy, then you need to go to the polls and you need to make a change, or you need to step up and put yourself on the line, and we need more people running for office so that the public have a choice, and we don't see that.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say is, if you pay only attention to what you hear in the media, then you're not going to realize the full gamut and actual universe of policies that were addressed by the legislature. Because a lot of those things are just not sexy, but they're important issues. They are critical in terms of government services and continuing on Hawaii on its betterment path. But those things don't hit the news. So if all you pay attention to is the Steve Tyler bill or to the Media Shield or marijuana, I mean, that's the stuff that's sexy and that's the stuff the newspapers write about. But that's not the majority of what the legislature is doing, nor is that what's really the administration is pushing for.
Well, we're down to about 2 minutes, and that's not fair to bring this up, but I have a tendency to do this. They were talking about accountability for UH. Where's the accountability for the Department of Education? Is that being looked at? Was there much oversight going on of the Department of Education or bills that you find particularly important this session?
I'd like to make mention that I think I was the only person in the House who voted against turning the university over to the governor. I preferred an elected board rather than an appointed board.
You're talking about the Board of Regents now. What about the Department of Education?
No, I'm talking about the Board of Education.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm talking about the Board of Education, that they should be elected rather than appointed, because then you have no accountability to the public. Now, of course, you have the governor, but you don't have the accountability to the public.
Yeah, the one thing I would say in answer to that question is when we do look at the budget, what the legislature did was they put in a lot of provisos on the Department of Education in terms of transparency, notice, and reporting. And so if you want some accountability, that's how you're going to get it. And so the Department of Education now has to step up with actual reporting to the legislature and be held accountable for the results.
And we did the new board that appointed and not elected, and they've only been there for about 2 years now. So we're going to continue to oversee them and hold them accountable.
Beth, 15 seconds I give you. Where do you find Department of Education accountability?
I think we need to keep working on it, and my personal feeling is that we probably should have cracked that nut before we passed early childhood education, but that's just my feeling. I think we need to keep working on it, and we need to work hard because it's important.
We're out of time. I think you guys can tell I really enjoy talking to you folks. It was a no drama legislature this session, but in many ways that was wonderful. And thank you all for your hard work and from up there on the 5th floor too. Next week it will be a month since bombs exploded at the finish line of the Boston Marathon, and our own Honolulu Marathon is just 7 months away. In the aftermath of the Boston bombing, what new security measures are being planned for large public events in Hawaii? We'll look at the challenges of beefing up security with the State Department of Defense, marathon planners, and a Hawaii runner who crossed the Boston finish line just before the bomb blast. That's next time on Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Dan Boylan. A hui hou.